I thought I might begin with the story of how I came to Theosophy. And I think I would call this story, How the Future Changes the Past. You'll understand in a minute. So, about 2005, I was answering questions on an astral projection forum on the internet. My desire was to learn what the people on this forum were thinking about astral projection, what they were trying, what they were getting stuck with, in preparation for writing a book which became A Multidimensional Human. So sometime during that year, someone sent in a post about a book by someone named Andy Besant called Man in His Bodies. And I thought, okay, I think I need to read this book. So I got a copy, I read it. I totally fell in love with Annie Besant, with her teaching, with her speaking voice, which, because all of her books mainly were made up from lectures that she'd given, that people had transcribed, her speaking voice. I began reading everything I could get by her. I started reading the Arthur Powell books about the different bodies. Some of you may know those. I began reading anything I could get that was by Leadbeater. So at that point, I was totally immersed. I struggled a little bit with some of the historical aspects of the Theosophical Society as I found them. But in 2008, I said, I'm joining for Annie Besant. Whatever else is going on there, she's my gal. I'm going to join and support her. So as far as I was concerned, I'd never really heard of the Theosophical Society until around that time. But I was digging around in an old box of stuff from college, and I found one of my engagement books. I opened it up, and my birthday in 1980, it said, went out to lunch with so-and-so, talked about the Theosophical Society. Now, I don't think that entry was there before I joined. That's what I mean by the future changing the past. I have no memory of that. But it was on its way. It just took a while before I let it sink in. Do you know the story, Tim?
The selection process is the more difficult part. I don't think I was fortunate in the same way that Kurt was to be exposed to the Theosophical Society through someone such as the writings of one of our great writers. As a matter of fact, my introduction to the Theosophical Society took place. I was not looking for the Theosophical Society at all. If you had asked me, I was college trained. If you had asked me, I would have told you I really do like the way life is right now, you know, with all the enjoyments that come with the college experience, particularly in the US. It was very nice. The only thing that I was very conscious that I was lacking, you know, the enjoyment was there, the mental stimulation, the friendships, all of those things were all there. The only thing that was lacking, and it was something that became conscious over the bit of time, was direction. Except for having a direction in life, everything else was great. But anyway, that wasn't something I was going to worry too much about. Circumstances took hold of things, and I found myself visiting with a cousin of mine who lived in Chicago, where I live now. At that point, I was in New York and going to school in the East Coast of the United States. And visiting him, I may have shared some of this with you before. He was a person I hadn't seen in a couple of years, but when I saw him this time, he was changed. Changed in the sense that prior he was kind of ungrounded, a little bit wild. You know, perfect person to go and spend your spring break with was my thought at the moment. But this time when I got there with him, and we shared a room, and he would get up early in the morning, something very atypical for him. And I'd be waking up, and he'd be sitting, you know, facing the wall, not moving. And he'd sit there, you know, 10, 15, 20 minutes. I didn't have a context for this. And I asked him, what are you doing, Kurt? He says, well, I'm meditating. I mean, in this crowd, that's obvious. But for me, I was not exposed to the meditation crowd at that time. Fine. I said, okay, you're meditating. And he gave me something to read a little bit about that. And, this kind of, not only was he meditating, but he was talking quite sensibly, which was also unusual for him. And, he added, I commented at one point, Barrett, it seems as if, things have kind of changed for you since I saw you last. He says, oh yeah, Tim, you need to meet my teacher. And, I mean, again, you have to jump into my mindset, in 1973 or whatever it was. Not only was the mind different, the hair was this long and everything else was matched that look. And I didn't go on vacation to meet with teachers. In my mind, I had left them when I went away from the university. I had 2 weeks break, and then I'll be back with teachers. But anyway, he dragged me along to meet his teacher, which turned out to be this very alive, very charismatic person. I sat there with him for a period of time. And he was talking. And he was saying things that I hadn't really heard particularly before, but it was all about the inner life. Anyway, I'm trying to think how to make it a needlessly long story short. Anyway, as things worked out, he was interesting, but I was ready to go. So I'm at the door to say goodbye. He says, I will see you soon, son. Which was unexpected because I was leaving very early the next morning. So at that point, I had heard enough of this confident man, talking about deep things. And so I told him, I don't think so. And the reason why, I wasn't being rude. The reason why is because I'm leaving early the next morning. Fine. Anyway, we leave, and then circumstances again take hold, and I find myself back there again that same night. Not by my intention. I didn't plan on coming there. But my cousin, he drives by. I didn't know Chicago, but I recognized we had been at this place earlier in the day. And we walk in, and this time, actually when I was leaving the first time, and I said goodbye, he said, I'll see you soon, son. I forgot that. I walk in the door, he's there, he says, hey, we meet again, don't we? And then he went on to talk about the reason I had come to see him. I didn't know that was the reason, but he answered a question that had been deeply in my mind. And then he started to talk about theosophy, ageless wisdom. But he spoke about it in a manner that was uniquely suited to touch the mind of a 19 or a 20-year-old. It wasn't clogged with terminology. It was very direct, very understandable. To make his point more clear, and to be sure that he had my attention, he also took a brief spell to start talking to me about things that had occurred in my own life that he wasn't there to see. Neither was anyone else. But, just to make the point that he wasn't just talking for talk's sake. He was a man who, it turns out, was deeply clairvoyant, and he would utilize it in that way. Anyway, after that, I left. Started to think about some of the things that he had been talking about while I had some space to be by myself. And in that process of walking and thinking, I had an experience that shifted everything. I didn't have any category to put that experience into, having not been exposed to these concepts. So, but you know, that opened the door, because the problem is, once you see something that's real, you cannot unsee it. So you're kind of doomed from that point on. Once you see something that is real, to settle for anything less, or to direct yourself towards something that is familiar, previously enjoyable, a lot of those things lose their taste. So I was kind of messed up in that respect. And, you know, my solution to it was to write a letter to him, describe what had happened. And he invited me to come study with him, which I did. I thought it was going to be for 3 months. It ended up being for 13 years. And that was my introduction to Theosophy. I had to start at a ground level and work my way into the depth of the concepts related to this. I had to build a body of understanding based on knowledge. And that, you know, that was a big part of the process. A more important part of the process that went along with it was the idea of kind of stripping away many of the kind of obstacles and barriers that we have internalized to the actual experience of wisdom. We can talk about it, it's very easy to talk about. But the experience eludes us until certain kind of inner things. We've done the work. So anyway, that was my introduction to the Theosophical Society. Again, I thought it was going to be 3 months. I had been with him for 1 evening, and I had this total transformative awakening. I said, 3 months, I'll be ready for life. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. Ideally, you reach a point where you find out that no matter how deeply versed you are, or even deeply experienced, we haven't yet scratched the surface. So anyway, that's kind of the thing. So, in my conversations with Kurt prior to coming here, you know, over the years we've interacted. You know, Kurt has he operates from another level of sensitivity. And that is one that is varied. Many people, probably many of you, are sensitive at varying different levels. So it's something that you find is another. Most people have difficulty dealing with 5 senses. When you have some kind of introduction and sensitivity to yet another level, then it's very, very good to be able to check in with people who kind of have experience in that world. So that's also part of this theosophical journey. Do you think?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think this is illustrated. I think this is definitely true, and I think it's illustrated by how Tim and I met. So there was a workshop at Pumpkin Hollow, which is one of the beautiful theosophical summer camps that exist in the United States, on the East Coast in New York, some hours north of New York City. And I had just gotten back at dinner time from having driven some people from the train station nearby who had come up from the city to Pumpkin Hollow. Dinner was already well along by that time. I really had to eat very quickly to move on to the next thing. Tim walks in, or I notice him at some point during this. He has his arm in a sling. I forget why. What was it? I think you explained that you did something you shouldn't have done.
Well, I can tell the story now. My wife really beat me. Wait a minute. That's not true. That's not true. I had to have a shoulder surgery.
So, everyone's checking me out. I come into the Theosophical Society, I join. I'm already a clairvoyant. I've already had out-of-body experiences. Everybody is thinking, who is this guy? What does he want from us? how many people is he going to steal from us? Because, you know, schisms sometimes develop from charismatic people coming into a lodge. So Tim was going to check me out. He came over with his arm in a sling. He's standing over my shoulder wanting to say hello. My mouth is full. I don't know what to say because I have to eat as fast as I possibly can. He's looking at me, waiting for me to stop chewing, and all of a sudden he just relaxes, and I went, oh, he just checked me out and decided I'm okay. And you know, when I checked that out with him after we got to know each other better, he said, yeah, that's right. So he talked about different levels of clairvoyance. I think that's one that he's got. He knows, hopefully, a good man what he needs from.
I remember the first thing he said to me while I was eating. He said, no, no, no. I can never forget.
That was Sanskrit.
I know that's what you told me later. I still doubt it.
My favorite mantra.
No, actually, Kurt had written a book.
Comes before
I remember someone talking about as a mantra. And if you say it enough, it vibrates and it creates this kind of sense of happiness.
Right. There's your science.
No, but Kurt had written a book, and it's a rare book, because, you know, for the Theosophical world, there was Leland, there was Besant, Dora Kuntz, you know, the Bendits to some degree. But the clairvoyant side of things is something that was very much a part of the earlier second generation teachings within the Theosophical Society. And it's one of those subjects that is necessary, but also it all depends on whose hands this conversation is in. Because it's one of those things that can very easily go in directions that just mislead as much as they lead. Because this clairvoyant faculty is one that is, you know, in many ways you have to be able to deal with the personal filters that are, you know, everybody's getting something. And some people it's visual, auditory, intuitive. But, you know, until we've done sufficient amount of work in becoming self-aware, it's always going to be something that's colored to some degree. So separating that out is always, that's kind of the lifetime work. And then as that stream becomes pure, then it's something that's usable. Generally. But Kurt had written a book, and so one of the things that, as a rule, with the publishing house in America, it was something where, you know, we've had our clairvoyance, and we're not going to be publishing books related to psychic activity or clairvoyance. But Kurt's book was coming from a different point. I mean, it was something that was, first of all, it was based mainly on Annie Besant's comments on the psychic realm. You know, she talked about psychic as that which is beyond normal physical perception. So that's a broad range. And he was able to deal with it in a way that he was able to speak to it and allow you to think, come to your own conclusions, which is rather unusual. So it was a book that we did publish, and I was on that committee that determined that, and I can say that there was some difference of opinion, but we published it.
I know that person. We're friends now. Thank goodness.
You all will be able to talk like this as we work with each other over the years. I know that person.
Well, we have a history, and we need to know it, and we're always creating it, and some of it is rough, and some of it's glorious, and from my perspective, I love the Theosophical Society and its history, and all of the messiness, too, because that's human. You know, we're all about evolving humanity, and we can't pretend that we are more evolved than we are. And if an issue comes up, a eventually we work through it, we move on, we keep going, we absorb it, we learn from it, hopefully. But at least for me, some of the stuff that I read about the history of 100 years ago is a fascinating study in what happens when people try to create a world civilization, because that was really the project in the 1910s and 20s, that reflects higher spiritual values, and that I think anyone in this room would have loved to live in, to be born into. But what is that project, and where does it come from, and is it really possible? Can we hurry up human evolution so that it can meet our expectations of what we would like to experience out of life? I love Annie Besant dearly, but I really think she made a mistake in thinking she could hurry up the process of evolution the way she was planning to. And yet, her plans for a new world are very, very worthwhile looking into, because there's no reason why we can't keep aiming towards them. And I think, as I've watched the Theosophical Society develop over the 15 years that I've been involved, one of the things that I've noticed is that the Besant and Leadbeater tradition is slowly disappearing under the pressure, I'll call it, to go back to basics, to Blavatsky and the Mahatma letters. And those are glorious subjects, but there's also this other tradition. I think it's worth retaining, and even worth finding ways to modernize, so to speak, so that our present day is able to accept and understand and learn from that. That's one of the reasons, as you've heard me say during this week, we have to think about another word than purity to talk about the work that you need to do to prepare yourself for any kind of clairvoyant work. Because I don't know any young person these days who would want to sign up for that. On the other hand, there are other things like flexibility of consciousness, which is one of the results that you have when you do this cleaning out of the lower bodies. That sort of sounds like going to a health club, working out. That seems to be more appealing. So my purpose has been very much, since I came into the Theosophical Society, make sure the Besant and Leadbeater tradition lasts, and also make sure that it's repackaged and in some ways brought forward in a different context with other words that help to make it more sense, make more sense, but also recognize that it's a very practical and very safe path for the development of our third object abilities.
And one of the difficulties, see, I'm in a very different position now. I have, when I come to a place, a meeting such as this, these days, the seat in the room tends to be here, which has historically, for Tim, that wasn't where I was going to be seated. I kind of liked the back. But one of the things that, I have to look at is, these ideas that Kurt was talking about. In a certain way, you're here because of the path of cooperation. This was a theme. Path of cooperation for the spiritual life, or in the spiritual life, and the spiritual life. So, the idea of a cooperative experience, what are the benefits of that? How does that interact with this whole idea of the spiritual life? I don't think the spiritual life, a genuinely spiritual life, is a possibility in isolation. I mean, you can have a variety of experiences that you can sit in alone and cultivate. And of course, that is also part of what we're always doing. But I don't think that was the intention for something like a Theosophical Society. And I think in its early days, it was clearly expressed that we're not just here to make something for, the few to have, deep experiences of what they would describe as occultism, that might be occultism stripped of the aspect that really is most important, which is compassion. So it's not for that. The Theosophical Society, again, you hear me talking, this is according to me. I don't want you to blame Blavatsky or Alcott for anything that I say. The Theosophical Society came into being to really seed the consciousness of humanity with certain very powerful ideas that were withering. A new expression of those that took in a new range of depth. These things were planted, and they, as with any seed that you plant, it's not planted for the present. So, you know, the founders of the Theosophical Society, all of them, suffered enormously in terms of constant sort of betrayals. Betrayals mainly based on limited understanding. People are being who they are. It wasn't like they had, you know, they had it in for Blavatsky or for Alcott. It's just that they could not capture, they couldn't encompass the scope of this thing. We can't. But the idea has been that these seeds are planted for a future harvest. And I do believe that in many ways, much of what was planted at that time is kind of coming to fruition in this moment where we find ourselves. Because when we look around, I was in a meeting earlier this morning, and it was with members of Rosicrucians, the people who head up the Rosicrucian Society here, the Anthroposophical, Theosophical, all coming from common roots. But, you know, part of the idea was, in this moment, what is it that we have to offer to the world? And, you know, in many ways, another teaching is not the thing that's going to do the job. Even though we have probably, when you talk about theosophy, the reason I am with the Theosophical Society is because I have not found anything that exceeds it. And believe me, if I had, I wouldn't be here. I'm not a loyalist in the sense that I'm here just because that's the obligation or anything like that. I'm here because I have found nothing contradictory or nothing that exceeds it. So, you know, the thing that we have to offer is not a new set of concepts for people to digest. That's helpful, and it's necessary. But because these things that have been put forward as theosophy are real, they're alive. And to the extent that we can connect ourselves with this living kind of presence that inhabits what we think of as theosophy, from that we can move to other levels of our own experience. And the only way that we can communicate, the only way that we can teach is by example. It's the example of the energy and the consciousness that has been cultivated within you that ensouls the words that come out of your mouth or off your pen. Or probably not a pen nowadays, off your keyboard. And even that is probably on your phone now. So. But I mean, that's the thing. So we need this conceptual basis. We need a deepening knowledge. But the real value of knowledge is power, yes. But only within its range. Knowledge and wisdom are very different things. Theosophy is the ageless wisdom. And, you know, you're not comparing apples and oranges when you talk about knowledge and wisdom. It's more like apples and universe. Or apples and eternity, apples and duration. They are qualitatively different, but We point ourselves in the direction of the experience of that, and then it communicates in everything else. There's an expression that, first of all, the spiritual life, in this cooperative sense, it is intentional. You're not going to unfold accidentally. So if you're waiting for the confluence of accidents, you wait enough lifetimes, maybe something like that happens. But it's an intention. But illumination, the expression is enlightenment is an accident, which is to say you don't have any control over it. If you did, we'd all be enlightened. Enlightenment is an accident, but practice makes you accident prone. So, I like that idea because it's true. It's a long way of saying, what do you think, Kurt?
I was just thinking, maybe we need some questions from the audience. What do you think?
Well, I didn't even know we had an audience, but these people, the rest of us.
They've been awfully quiet.
Well, you've been captivating. No, why don't we do it this way? Anything that anybody has to offer or to say at any time, do it.
Yep. I'll just comment briefly on my, I guess you could say, historical perspective. Back in 1909, Annie Besant did a series of lectures in London called The Changing World. And one of the lectures was called The Protestant and the Catholic Spirit in the Theosophical Society. And she did not mean Protestant and Catholic in the sense of the sects that are involved with Christianity. What she meant was that there's something in the human spirit that is either Catholic in the sense of universal and Protestant in the sense of it being fundamental. And so even within the Adyar group, there already were people who were focused on going back to the fundamentals. There was a quite strong back to Blavatsky movement in the 1920s, partially because Annie Besant was going in the direction of promoting Krishnamurti as the world teacher, and also this world change civilization that I was mentioning earlier. And she felt that ceremonies were helpful, and devas were involved with ceremonies, and clairvoyance was necessary to view devas, and all of this was irrelevant from the perspective of the Protestants. But from the more Catholic side of things, it embraced the invisible worlds in a way that was maybe practical, but definitely, what's the word I'm reaching for, relevant and important to cultivate. And it seems that the more Protestant side says no. So historically, back in 1895, there was a big split. That's when Judge and the American section left, and the Adyar section went on its own. And the Judge section split several more times. And at this point, from what I understand, there have been a number of movements in the direction of reconciliation. But again, from my perspective, reconciliation seems to me mean we want to hear what you Adyar folks say about Blavatsky and the Mahatma letters. We don't want to hear about what you have to say about Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater. So I think some of the interactions for the discussions of the secret doctrine and the Mahatma letters, where I've experienced mixed groups, tremendously fruitful, because the perspectives of deep students are valid, no matter whether you come from the one brand Protestant so-called or Catholic so-called. And there is a set of conferences that I've been invited to numerous times if I wasn't going to speak about my expertise, which is Annie Besant. So what do you do with that?
Don't go.
Exactly. So,
Yeah. Now, this is something that comes up from time to time. I was in where was it? California, Esalen. But anyway, we were in a dialogue, and there was someone there, came down for some questions. The person got up and said, "Look, the Theosophical Society, there have been so many schisms, divisions in its history. You sit here, you're the international president supposedly, but there are 4 or 5 or 6 different Theosophical societies that have kind of separated and gone their own way. How can you speak about unity when, the Theosophical Society is not even unified in this?" That was his question. And of course, it's one of these, it was something parading as a question that was leading me toward the answer that he already knew in his own mind, that it's not, you cannot be representative of unity. But to me, in answering his question, to me, you have a variety of different organizations and movements that have come from a common root. And because of that, you have an anthroposophical expression that is able to reach different people that might not be attracted to the other. You have a ULT, and you have all of the different branches. To me, it was more a matter of the truth that was inherent in that being spread more broadly. This isn't schisms. It may have resulted from disagreements, and it did. Historically, with Blavatsky's death, the kind of unifying force for the expression of theosophy went away. And with Annie Besant's ascension, the fact that she was so strong in her mind and in her following her directions and her intuition, many people did not respond to that. This idea that there's going to be a world teacher, this idea that the many things that came through her were not acceptable. And here you're telling me that this 13-year-old, Krishnamurti, this is the world teacher. I don't know if I would have gone along with that. Krishnamurti didn't go along with it when he got to be 30 years old, although I think he was wrong. He was a world teacher. But the role and the idea that it is so susceptible to self-delusion is something that impacted the Theosophical Society at that time. Kurt told me that he shared, a little bit about the history. Well, he shared it as a story that with you all about someone, getting up in the morning after breakfast and saying, "Oh, last night, the master came to me, and I had the second initiation." And then there's someone at the table with them, "Oh, that's nothing. I had the 4th initiation last night, and the Mahachohan was here with me." Yeah, it sounds funny. That happened here. Here. At this place where you all are sitting, where you're going, that happened here. That was the level of distractedness that can enter in with this. Rituals galore were generated. This wasn't Krishnamurti's doing, but because he was the coming world teacher, then there would be disciples, and because, the pattern is that there were 12 disciples, 12 disciples were named, not by Krishnamurti. It was delusory. It's part of our history. You don't deny it. You are happy that you experience it, and you move beyond, and hopefully you move beyond with something deeper inside of you. It's part of what caused this kind of reaction, what Kurt is talking about. That people swung against this kind of Besant and Leadbeater approach to theosophy. Not because it was essentially wrong in any way, but because you can hear that teaching so very differently according to what it is that your need is. And that's what affects people. Basically, we're all sitting here because the Theosophical teaching is something that has connected with us on some level, that has put us in this seat. And it may not even be the teaching so much. It might be the attraction to people, or the attraction to a movement, or the attraction to a group that I can share with. Something has put us here because it touched something. And so we're here, in a sense, to try to satisfy some level of personal need. And there's nothing wrong with that. We're human, and that's how we function. But along the way, if we find that this experience, that it grows within us into something of the nature of experience, then that level of personal attachment starts to loosen. And, you know, at a certain point, truth is truth, wherever you find it. So, I mean, along that line, we've tried to work with these various groups that have tried to bring the theosophical movements together. Never with the idea that it's going to be one organization, because everybody's got different views, but to bring them together. Theosophical Society, Adyar, is the largest of these societies by far in the world. But, you know, it's something that's an experiment. We're trying to work with it. The idea is that there should be some sort of cross-pollination, is the words that have been used. You know, my only difficulty with it is that the cross-pollination, as we have experienced it, has all been cross-pollination from the Theosophical Society, Adyar, toward everyone else, and then nothing comes back. But still, we don't stop. We had a convention in India, the annual convention. And to that convention, I had invited the person who was heading up one of the ULT things in the United States, as well as the person who was head of the Pasadena group in The Hague, here in the Netherlands, to speak to the convention. And I hadn't thought of it, but Herman Vermeulen, he came up to speak and he says, you know, this is the first time in the history of the Theosophical Society that someone from one of the other organizations has been invited to speak. And I was sitting up there on the stage and I said, I guess that's true. But I mean, why? Everybody that was part of the controversies that split these groups apart, they're all dead. You know, I mean, let's face it. All of them are dead and gone, so how do you manage to carry some sort of dissension that you had no involvement in, unless you just want to? Personally, you know, for the Theosophical Society Adyar, that's not my concern. I think if you have people who are active, who are expressive of this truth, who are doing things, those are people we want to connect with. But yeah, that's...
I want to just say a couple little comments based on what Tim said. One of them is, I remember overhearing a doctor say at the beginning of the pandemic, we are building this plane while flying it. And you know, if you think about a utopian society based on a principle of universal brotherhood, when was that ever done in the way that the Theosophical Society was doing it? I think the mistakes were inevitable because we were building that plane while we were flying it. That's the first point. The second one is, think about our first object, to build a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity. There's nothing in that that says there can't be multiple nuclei. It says A. You could have A this one, and A that one, and A this one, and A that one. It seems to me that it's only natural that there would be different attempts to build the same plane, if you get my meaning. And that from that perspective, they're all valid, they're all valuable. We know, for example, the residential community that Catherine Tingley created, which was one of the alternative Theosophical societies, had a fairly autocratic structure that I think many of us today would find oppressive, and yet there were people who really thrived in that environment. And that history is just as worthy, and tradition is just as worthy of preservation as the one that we're more familiar with. So I think for me, going forward, I would always like to remind myself, here's a nucleus, and here's a nucleus, and we're all building our planes or we're flying them, and they're all trying to realize universal brotherhood in some way. And let's learn from all of that and rebuild our society from what we learned, instead of don't listen to them, which is the way it's been for far too long.
I mean, quite honestly, if anyone were to find more value in a different approach, I would encourage you to embrace that approach. Otherwise, you're really not being true to yourself. Yeah. In Chicago, they used to have, there was this street, and they had, they called them storefront churches. I mean, so what you had was a street, and the neighborhood had declined. And so there were little businesses and all these storefronts. But as their businesses closed, little churches would move in and, you know, rent the building. And so if you were to walk down this particular street on a Sunday, you know, you would walk down and you look in one door and there's 12 people hitting the tambourine and raising their hands and praying. You go to the next door and there's someone up standing in a pulpit preaching to them. Next door, they're speaking in tongues. Every little storefront had a church, but every one of them was the proper place for each of the people in there to be, until it was no longer the place for them. And so, I mean, that's the situation. If we ever make the mistake of believing that in some way we have encountered the ultimate perfection, well, I would just say it's a mistake. From time to time, depending on the group I'm talking to, it's a joke, but you decide if it's really a joke. I will tell people that the Theosophical Society is perfect in every way. The only problem is the people. The only problem with this attempt at moving us closer to an experience of truth is us and our undeveloped, the best of us, the ones we might think of as the highest among us, are undeveloped just by the fact that we're here. If we were so developed, we wouldn't be sitting around having these conversations. But, you know, that's the thing that you, in a certain way, there has to be some level of acceptance of that in yourself and in those that we're going to be dealing with in our various groups and interactions. And then, you know, the process can move to deeper levels. But we have to get there. And again, it's not about the growth and perfection of me. That's part of it. But if that's as far as your focus goes, I mean, pretty much you might be a fairly well-developed, selfish person, like all the rest. If that's good enough for you, great. Because there's nothing wrong with that. But for those who commit to something else, you end up, I mean, for instance, I'm the international president of a global organization with a rich history and all that. I was not attracted to this wisdom tradition to be the president of anything. I wasn't attracted to it for the the camaraderie and all. I was attracted to it because there was some experience that let me know there's something profound that's here. But along the way, you start to find out that in the absence of some degree of commitment to move or to be on behalf of others, your growth is limited. So even for the most selfish person, you're going to grow through your capacity to make something a little bit easier for someone else. And you know, once people start to see that in you, then they'll say, oh look, I mean, my case, I was setting up the chairs in the meetings and happy. Things go along, oh, well, maybe you could set it up for this talk. Well, Tim, why don't you give a talk? That was something new. I'd never done that. Tim, you know, why don't you take a position in the lodge? Why don't you become board of directors? Hey, why don't you become president of the Theosophical Society in America? You know, my response was yes, 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 up to that last question, where my response was no, 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 no. I like life without all of those things. But what you find is responsibilities shift. I mean, in my case, we have an international society with 260-acre campus of headquarters, 2 schools, a veterinary clinic in the city of Chennai that is the top level, probably certainly in southern India, that we have developed over time. You have a social welfare center, vocational training. You have all of these little experimental things that you do. You have a staff of 130 people in this place. And I didn't come here to administer these things. I mean, my attraction to this was probably very similar to yours. There's something here, and it's going to expand my experience of life and reality. That it helps others is great, but the more you say yes, the more these sorts of options expand. And you start to find that yes, the meditation work is a requirement. The study is a requirement. But spirituality and its expression do not end when you get up off of the mat, off of the cushion. There is no dimension of our lives that is not fully engaged in the cultivation of the spiritual life, if you can learn to see it that way. I mean, people have families. And, you know, to fulfill the type of responsibilities that are required to raise a family or to be part of a family is a deeply spiritual act, but only if you can see it that way. So it gets to the point that there is nothing that lies outside the realm of this cooperative endeavor in the spiritual life. But it's seeing it. And that probably is something that is part of a process. We have to kind of, in the beginning, train ourselves. But what you find is it takes an enormous amount of effort to become effortless. And that's where it's at. The effortless part is where we are moving if we allow ourselves to go there.
There were lots of possible points of entry to that question. I think the only thing I would like to add is, in my traveling around the United States, working with the different camps and conventions and lodges, I've only ever been one place where children were involved. And that was at the Texas Federation Convention, where it happens there's a very, very strong lodge of Vietnamese people. And they are often younger married couples. They have very young families, and they brought them in to the Federation, and they were pretty much behaving like the children here. This is the second place where I've had that experience. And I have spoken at another Theosophical camp, Far Horizons, where one of the daughters of the original founder of the camps, almost 70 years ago now, kept photo albums of all of the years. And I think there's a very valuable history going on there. I took photographs of all the photo albums. Families were going to the summer camp. Theosophical families were bringing their children every summer for a couple of weeks, and they all played together. They came from California and other places in the country. They did it every year. And what happened to that? I think when I came into the Theosophical Society, there was a feeling, I heard people express it, that it's rare for someone to come to Theosophy before the age of 50. Not that it's a matter of being mature enough for the spiritual teachings. It just happened that a couple of generations have been completely missed. And I would, by any means, say, have children so we can repopulate the Theosophical Society. But there's something about that family life, the example of that, for each other and for the rest of the community, that I think is probably the very best advertisement we could ever have. And I don't know how that could be brought back. I don't want to have this nostalgia for a lost golden age that I couldn't experience called a theosophical childhood, you know, because I found it, quote unquote, too late for that. But it's worth thinking about. What about what we do and who we are is somehow not being heard by the spiritual but not religious families who would really thrive under those conditions. So I know that wasn't the direct point of what you were talking about. At the same time, as you were talking about your ideals for your children, it seems to me to be something we all need to be thinking about. Did you have anything to add to that?
I think you spoke very well. Much better than when you had all that food in your mouth and
You know, you've got to love people who won't let you live downstairs because you're not letting them live downstairs. These are true peers. We have not had a chance to spar like this, even in person, not to mention in public. I'm ready for another one anytime. Let's do it.
I enjoy it. Small question. I think I'm kind of in a position where I have to kind of try to project things toward the future, even though if you really are determined to be wrong about something, you predict the future. In terms of, you know, oftentimes when we think about what is the future, you know, what does it look like? Pretty much we're talking about forms. You know, what are the forms that we will encounter in the future? And those things are, they're changeable. With the Theosophical Society, our headquarters in Adyar, we have a very wonderful place because it's really, in a way, it's a laboratory. We have an opportunity to experiment, to try things, to succeed, to fail, and to learn from those failures what it is that might be done differently. Even though it is not the point or the purpose of the Theosophical Society, it is intended that the lives of people in this world are in some way graced by their contact with this organization. And so even though it's not something that speaks toward membership, the work that we do with children, we have 2 schools, which at this point, it's maybe 700 some students. It will go up to twice that over time. One of the schools that we have has been operating for 128 years. It was founded by Colonel Olcott, and it was a school that provided an education to a caste within the Indian system who were not allowed to be educated because the nature of their birth was such that they couldn't interact with the groups above them. So they were not in school, didn't get any education, which assured that they would again be subservient. Olcott saw this and said, what do we do? Well, we start a school. And that school has grown to where now it's 500 students. All of them is a completely free school. All of the students are from this background that was untouchable. And these students now are thriving. They come from very difficult family backgrounds. I mean, because that level, the level of what we could talk about as lower income or lower levels within Europe or within America or South America, it's very different when you talk about something that's enforced by caste and is so historic. So these kids have opportunities that are remarkable for them and for the futures of those families. They may not associate it with Theosophy, but that experiment. We have a hostel where some of the kids that have the least opportunity, I mean, their home life, in order for them to thrive, they have to kind of separate themselves from the home life that they live. My wife Lily is deeply involved with the hostel. And so the boys stay there. But you know, you need to set up an environment where they too can thrive. We have another school that we've started in the last 3-4 years. We have a veterinary, you know, where we are dealing with animals, and it's not somebody brings in their prize poodle. It's stray animals on the streets. And in Chennai, you talk about an animal in Chennai, is anything from a goat to a cow to a dog. You know, plus there are wilder animals. And they are cared for. Shelter, you know, released. You know, we do rescue with them. And it's become, it has become definitely the most remarkable institution of its type in Chennai. And this is just in the last 4 or 5 years we've had that. So these are experiments. Along with that, you have a residential community, so you kind of, you intensify is the idea. You intensify a certain vibration, a certain magnetism, just within that campus itself. There are about 100 people that live there, full time. I don't think that it's at the level that it had been in the past. I mean, to a certain extent, it has been viewed for a long time as an ashram. And part of that ashram idea, I think, over time, the justification for the approach kind of diminished. But it was something that was rather exclusive and inward-looking, to the extent that the campus itself wasn't, I'd never been at a center, a theosophical center, that did not have certain sort of openings and outreach to the public that surrounds it. But Adyar had been in a condition where that's what it was. That's changed, and it's changing more and more. So we have an opportunity to experiment with things that will affect the future in terms of the forms that we will see and the lives that people can lead. Ultimately, though, the point for a Theosophical Society is the capacity for self-transformation. And to the extent that that becomes something that people commit to, then the future society that we see will necessarily be a changed form, but it'll be ensouled by a life that is vibrant and expressive of the next moment's need. It's always changing.
Well, I'm going to introduce a cliche that is, I think, completely appropriate, and I think you'll agree that it's relevant to our week together, and that is, the future is you. Now,
don't get a big head about it, though.
So, from my perspective, the Theosophical Society has been walking on 2 legs instead of 3 for quite a long time. And that's unstable, even though we would think that 2 legs is as stable as we could possibly get. The 3rd leg, of course, is the 3rd object, and we focused on that here. I made the point during the first day's lecture that there is nothing at all contradictory about the idea of universal brotherhood and unity consciousness and the 3rd object, because ultimately, the one, the absolute, the unity that we're all aspiring to reunite with at the end of our evolutionary cycle, that is the source of every so-called latent power in humanity. And what brings out those latent powers is climbing what Annie Besant calls the ladder of oneness, which starts with the lower levels of being and goes through the human levels and adds in the invisibles and the whole world and all of that. Every one of those stages requires a different kind of sensitivity for us to bring to it what it needs that we're able to supply to support its growth and evolution. And because evolution is the nature of the universe that we live in, and we have been, in a sense, assigned the task of returning to oneness with the great being that shed us, or that sent us out on this journey, every step that we climb closer requires a much more expansive state of consciousness and a much more sensitive calibration of our spiritual powers. So in the course of this week, we've surveyed what that involves. We've looked at what we do for ourselves, we've looked at what we do for others, we've looked at what we can do for the mineral, the vegetable, and animal layers of life. We've looked at what we can do for the dying and the dead. Today we looked for the devas, tomorrow we look at the masters. This is the ladder of life that we're all climbing, and the 3rd object gives us the strength to do the work that's required at any of these levels. From my perspective, for you to be present and for me to place these ideas in front of you could be enormously transformative, not just within the Theosophical Society, which has neglected its 3rd object for a while, but for the world. The world cries out for unity consciousness. Young people understand the importance of it. What are the tools? We have this tremendous history. We have all this richness of teachings. We have amazing teachers that are all talking about unity consciousness. They use the word brotherhood, which maybe needs a little bit of updating compared to what it meant in the past. It has a different meaning now. But the ideas are all there. Many practices are there. The charts that I've shown you are derived from all of the books that I've read to help people understand the different levels of being and how we can be of service. You go out in the world from this seminar as young Theosophists, and you are the future of the Theosophical Society, and to some extent, I hope, the future of the world. So it's been a wonderful privilege for me to be present with you and for you to ask me the questions that you have and for me to support you in the ways that you've asked me to, the lectures, the conversations over dinner, the encounters out in the forest, walking on the paths, and so on. So, if Tim didn't know it yet, I've introduced to you the future of the Theosophical Society.
How's that for a weight and a responsibility? But I don't have any misgivings about the future. I mean, quite honestly, for those who are invested in the nightly news, things look bleak. I mean, that's profitable for things to look bleak. But things are divisive, I mean, that's for sure. But the beauty of it is that, for instance, a meeting such as this, at which a certain type of consciousness has been developed, a certain sort of harmony has been experienced, at least at times. This isn't being reported on anybody's nightly news. And it's happening all over the world, at every level of human activity. There are people of consciousness who are present. I mean, humanity is not abandoned. We just have this habit of creating karmic consequences. You know, we've lived with a certain way of living for a little bit past its expiration date. And so now we're always kind of faced with the need for sudden rehearsals of, and these things don't happen suddenly. So, you know, there's certain kind of consequences. Years ago, when I first started talking to groups, I would make the point, at that particular time, when you would talk about the scientific models for climate change and things like that, it was something that was clearly severe, but it was something that would happen at a future. The way I would present it is, my poor daughter, she's going to have to experience all of this, because of course I'll be dead and gone. Now, as our habits have not changed, and as the modeling processes have become more precise, of course I'm not getting out of this. The sorts of things that have been put into place, some of it, the consequences are unavoidable. I mean, we have to rectify, but you don't just get out of jail free. So, I mean, these are things. Any point in human development, there are always crises. It's not something that's unique to any one time. And at any point in human development, there are crises that are met, that are experienced, that are moved through, and that hopefully at least some aspect of it develops into some new form of expression. That's going to be the gift that you all receive from the generations that have come before in creating this climate, this environment that we live in. It's a global environment now. Anyone who becomes illumined, it can immediately ripple out into the family of human beings. That was not possible before. I mean, it was out there, but only those who were tuned to it. But now these things are different. So, I mean, that's something that is, we're going to be dealing with, and in order to deal with it, you just have to recognize that you're not alone in any of this. And these connections start to become more and more visible over time. So that's something that's very, very hopeful. You don't get new leaves on the trees in the spring until the old leaves have fallen away. And so to a certain extent, this is a process. It's not one to be feared, but it is one to be acknowledged. And again, intention. What's your intention in interacting with this moment that we're all sharing? And that'll determine, of course, the future. That's a keen and accurate observation. When we talk about global theosophy, the wisdom tradition didn't skip over any continents. it didn't, you know, come to India and to Europe, and then the rest of us were left out of the picture. It's something that's present in all of them. We are dealing with a world that has been shaped by certain historical currents. One of those currents has been a colonial culture that emanated, you know, primarily out of this European center, but the United States got very involved to a certain degree. So, I mean, you have a certain colonial, remnant that is active in our consciousness. It is one of the requirements of the colonial experience that there be an inferior and a superior people. You can't colonize someone unless you at least feel or create some mythology to elevate yourself above the ones who you're extracting their resources and their wealth. So, I mean, that's something that has, it's a global phenomenon. I've heard someone, I had a course one time, a very profound person was teaching about it was about the Bhagavad Gita. And, you know, I made the comment, I used to have a lot of sessions. There was a group that met at my home, and any evening, we do it every week, it'd be like 20 to 50 people, depending on what it. But, you know, you would come to that group, and it was, I would have, you know, Joy Mills, all these people who I knew come talk. But it was always rather impressive to them, because when they would come to the group, probably 50% of the people there were African American. And you don't see that in any group, in the US or elsewhere. Why? And these were serious students of Theosophy. But you know, one of the problems is, and it has been a problem even with youth, you know, everybody going back a century, you know, where are the youth? Where is the youth? Well, you know, where you find one, you can find another. You know, youth attracts youth.